listening to The Secrets We Keep, and these are our hosts, Addy Melton,
Alexa Miles,
and Allison Hodge.
Today, we are going to discuss the ethics of human experimentation and the role of journalism in uncovering truths. And you may be asking why these topics are on our mind, and honestly, it's because we listen to the podcast called Limetown. I'm sure you've heard of this hit of a podcast, but if you haven't, it's about an investigative journalist named Leah Haddock uncovering the truth about what happened to the 326 people who mysteriously vanished. But before we get into this episode, we would like to say a huge thanks to Taco Bell for sponsoring this podcast. You should try their cheesy gordita crunch because it is bomb. Anyway, speaking of the ethics of human experimentation, what are you guys' overall opinion on it?
I think in general it can depend on whether the product of the experiment is actually worth the cost of a human life, and if the experimenter actually withholds the what is agreed upon in the consent form of the experiment when it's actually being executed.
Yeah, I agree with that because I definitely think there are many things that could go wrong, but overall I think that a lot of the results have proved to be beneficial to our society, and we wouldn't be here today without those.
So going into you guys' differing opinions, what would you guys say are the pros and cons of human experimentation?
Definitely one of the pros is results that may not have been as accurate if human experimentation was not used. So if there's a specific product being tested and it's just tested on either animals or isn't even tested at all, it could end up harming a lot of consumers, versus if there was human experimentation, it could be all of that harm to consumers could be prevented.
I think along with that there are some cons, mainly surrounding harm to the subjects, if they don't know fully what they're getting into, and if they were lied about the conditions and all of that stuff. So I think there are a lot of both pros and cons.
I definitely agree with that, because a lot of the times the experimenter's number one priority is the actual results of the experiment, and is oftentimes not the actual safety of the subject.
So going into that, do you guys have any examples or stories of good human experimentation and bad human experimentation in real life studies?
A good example of bad human experimentation were the Nazi experiments during World War II, where a comprehensive study documented a minimum of 15,754 victims of Nazi research experiments. Of these, there were 4,120 confirmed deaths, with an additional 244 pending confirmation. And even though there were 24,010 survivors, many of these had severe physical disabilities and lifelong consequences. A lot of the human subjects going into this had no consent at all, and they were prisoners of war that were being experimented on. And so this was definitely a very bad example of human experimentation.
So this experiment in World War II led to the Nuremberg trials, which overall resulted in the Nuremberg Code, which is a set of rules for human experimentation, and I can say a couple of them. So one of them, the main one, was that the consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, and another one was that the results need to be beneficial for the good of society, and another one was to make sure that the conditions of the experiment were safe and healthy, it should be held by scientists, and the facility should be adequate and stuff like that.
So although these Nuremberg codes were implemented in society, there were still many cases of human experimentation where they were not applied. And honestly, one example of this is obviously Limetown. I mean, the people who were going into Limetown, they were not given the discretion that they had the right to be put in this human experimentation. They didn't know what they were going into, and I think that's a really good way how the ethics of human experimentation tie into the podcast Limetown, because there honestly were none, and these people deserved better. So speaking of Limetown, our main character of this podcast, Leah Haddock, was an investigative journalist, and our second topic is actually the role of journalism in uncovering truths. So what do you guys think would cross the line between just straight up investigative journalism and just being invasive?
Some things that cross the line between journalism and the invasion of a person's privacy are if the victim is made uncomfortable or if their safety is compromised. Furthermore, it comes into question whether the truth is actually being told for the sake of telling the truth and getting the story out, or if the journalist is just making a spectacle out of a person's trauma.
So speaking of crossing lines, would you be willing to compromise your safety and the safety of other people to uncover truths that might have been better left untold?
So yeah, that question is like honestly the key throughout Limetown. Leah Haddock, the main investigative journalist, and her subjects were put into like the public eye all of a sudden because of her interviews, and in the end it resulted in their disappearances. So over time, investigative journalism has solved many important issues that the world has, but some debatably surfaced or resurfaced controversial topics that have proved to be only harmful. The news might reach the wrong audience, causing even more problems for the interviewer and the subject, which they might not have even foreseen or consented to.
All in all, when covering the topics of the ethics of human experimentation and the role of journalism in uncovering the truths, the main lingering question to consider is the benefit of greater knowledge worth it if it comes at the expense of individual safety?
And lastly, again, thank you so much to our sponsor, Taco Bell. Guys, seriously, you gotta try that cheesy gordita crunch because it's really great. Anyway, thank you. And this is the end of episode 1 of Secrets We Keep with Addy,
Alexa Miles,
And Allison Hodge.
Thank you so much for listening. Today we discussed the ethics of human experimentation and the role of journalism in uncovering truths. We'll see you next time.